So hey guys, they have an 83 944 engine on this stand, and on this one here I have an 87 944 engine. Currently I'm breaking down both of these engines so that way I can get them cleaned up, and I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to go around and show you some of the differences between them. Now if you follow me on Facebook, then you'll know that I've already done a video on this, but it garnered so much interest that I thought I would go ahead and reshoot it, adding a few more details and some better lighting, and put it on YouTube for you guys. If you'd like to follow me on Facebook, well, I'll leave a link in the description below. I often post things there first and content that I don't ever put on YouTube, so be sure to check that out. But anyway, we're going to start here at the temp sender on the early engine. You can see it uses a button style sender. Early cars do not have the warning light, and also notice how small it is. Now we'll go over to the later engine, and you can see that it has a two-prong sender because it has a warning light and the gauge as well, and is much larger, so they are not interchangeable. Something to keep in mind if you're going to be putting an early engine into your later car, then you may lose the warning light functionality unless you're willing to drill and tap this out to the larger size. Of course, this is not an issue if you own a 924S. So as mentioned, using an early engine in a 924S is not an issue whatsoever, since 924S doesn't have the warning light either. Even though it uses the later block, it uses a temp sender that only has one spade, and it looks like this compared to the one the 944 uses that looks like that. So just for reference, here are the two different senders. As mentioned, they are two different sizes and not interchangeable whatsoever. This one, of course, is the early button style temp sender, and it is an M10-1, while the larger later one is an M14-125. Now, if you're planning to use an early engine in a later car, then you'll also have to drill all the way through the block, because since this one is much shorter, it does not actually go all the way into the water jacket like the later one does. And then of course you will also need an M14-125 tap. So as mentioned, you can see here that the later blocks are drilled all the way through to let this larger and longer temp sender sit inside the water jacket. Now keep in mind that the early blocks are not drilled all the way through. In fact, you can see that it just comes to a dead end right there. So if you are planning on swapping in the later temp sender into this engine, you're going to have to not only drill all the way into the block and tap it out, but you need to keep in mind that this boss is a little bit smaller at 23 millimeters compared to the later engines that are 25 millimeters. So next we're going to be talking about the oil cooler section here. I'm not going to be talking about the housings, although they did change. If you would like to see a video on that, I'll put a link on the screen now. As you can see, this early block has a collar here for the early OPRVs. Now the only ones that you can use with this block is the early 3-piece or the retrofit 1-piece OPRV, which is a little bit shorter than the later OPRV. And if this collar comes out, you have to make sure you put it back in, because it will not work without it. You can't just remove it and then put the later OPRV in there, because it's still not long enough inside here. The blocks are completely different. Now going over to the later block here, as mentioned, it uses the later 1-piece OPRV that is longer. So therefore this is the only one that it can use, and none of these are interchangeable. So next we'll be talking about the balance shafts and their covers. This cover is from the 83 engine, and this one is from the 87 engine. The first thing you may notice is it looks like they reinforced the covers here. Everything has ribs on it now, and they even added 4 bolts here that this one does not have. Not to mention that on the 87 that this hole is drilled and tapped out for the turbocharger oil supply. If it was a naturally aspirated model, then it was just capped off with this here. And next we have the early balance shaft. And then here we have the later balance shaft. You can see that they made some changes, and it is much larger and weighs nearly a pound more than the early balance shaft. Not to mention that it will not fit in an early block whatsoever. You can see it is just too wide to fit in there. It will only work in the much larger later block. So next we're going to talk a little bit about the pistons. And here we have the US market piston that was used up until 1987 in manual transmission cars. In 1988 they switched to a piston with a smaller dish, which gave the engine 10.2 compression. These early engines had 9.5 compression, and the later ones right before 88 had 9.7 compression due to a change in the combustion chamber of the head. Now over here we have the pistons that were used in the automatic transmission cars. As you can see, this has a much shallower dish, and the dish is almost the size of the face of the piston. So while there were many different pistons used in the 2.5 liter blocks, all of them had 100 millimeter bores, of course. That said, the early cylinder walls were a little bit thinner. You can see there, about 775. However, if you go over to the later cars, let's see, there's about a millimeter difference, and it is noticeable to the eye. So next we're going to be talking about the oil pumps. There are a few differences, and if you're trying to put a late oil pump on an early car or vice versa, then you will run into a few issues. Here we have an early pump, and you can see that it has this long boss here for the timing belt tensioner to rest on. Now the later cars have what's called the auto tensioner, and you can see it here, and notice that the oil pump does not have this long boss, or else it would be in the way and actually rub up against this. So the later oil pumps don't have this boss, and if you try and stick this oil pump onto a earlier engine, then you're not going to have a place for your eccentric tensioner to go. And in fact, if you try and torque this down with a bolt or something, then you're going to end up having this pushed up against the belt cover, and you could actually break your tensioner. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, the early oil pumps have a 55 millimeter front main seal, while the later oil pumps use a 52 millimeter. So here's the timing belt tensioner found on the early cars. It is eccentric, so as you rotate this, it tightens the belt, then you just lock down the nut. As mentioned, the later engines have what is called the auto tensioner, and it attaches to the block with these three studs here. And if I remember, you can get a better look. You can see that there are three bosses in the block that have these three studs in them. And the early engines do not have any provisions for these three studs. Now if I put it back on, then I'll try and show you how it works. Essentially, you just loosen this bolt here and this nut, and as you swing this arm down, it will compress this spring, and then you can lock these down, either or, and then you can put your belt around the cam, and then when you release them, then this spring will set the tension. Now, before I wrap this video up, I also wanted to mention a few other things that I saw. Here, I never see these tapped on the early engines. However, this is always tapped on the later engines, and I just wanted to point that out. Now, that should do it for this video, guys. Next time I'm going to be removing the oil pan, and then we'll get into all the differences between the early and late oil pans and the early and late dipsticks. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.